My father always said to me a lot of wise words, as many fathers do, but one thing he said to me was the best mistakes to learn from are... Anyone? Someone else's. The best mistakes to learn from are someone else's, aren't they? I don't know if they're the best mistakes because it's always painful to see someone else go through, but they're certainly the least painful experiences to learn from are someone else's mistakes. The best mistakes to learn from are someone else's. So one reason we're in this teaching series is exactly that, to have a look at the life of Rehoboam, to look at the mistakes he made, the decisions he made, and to learn from those, to learn from his errors and the decisions he made. So we're looking at that moment in history where King Solomon, who was known as to be the wisest man on earth, had died and his son Rehoboam had become king. And we're looking particularly at that moment under Rehoboam's leadership where the nation erupted and the kingdom split in two, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And this rupture is a major event in the life of the nation. And big moments like that in any nation, they don't just happen, do they? They're the result of a series of decisions. And so we're looking at the decisions that were made, decisions which split this nation, to see what we can learn from them. And that's obviously where the title of this series comes from, Split Decisions. How do our decisions help bring people together rather than split people apart? Of course, we've all made mistakes. We shouldn't just hammer in on Rehoboam. He made a few mistakes here, but we've all made mistakes. And our mistakes come from poor decisions. And often those poor decisions are driven by pride. And that never ends well, does it? You see, pride is sneaky. Pride's not always out there and blatant and arrogant that everyone can see. Sometimes pride is quiet. It's hidden. It's the quiet refusal to admit you were wrong. Sometimes pride is the cold distance in a relationship because you don't want to be the first to say, I'm sorry. Pride builds walls where humility could have built a bridge. And that's exactly what we see in today's reading. The people came to Rehoboam, King Rehoboam, and they say, your father made life hard for us. Would you ease up on us a little bit? And if you do, we will serve you and we will honour you. That's a reasonable request. You see, Solomon had started out his reign very, very well. He was the wisest man on earth. He was well liked. But towards the end of his reign, he became harder on the people. He had built his empire on the backs of heavy labour and high taxes. And the people at this point were exhausted. And so they come to Rehoboam and ask him to give them a break. And Rehoboam says, come back in 3 days and I'll give you my answer. Now, that's not a bad start, is it? Because we all know that the best decisions are not rushed. It looks like he's going to take his time to make this decision. But what Rehoboam does in those 3 days tells us everything about his character and his heart. And friends, this story isn't just about a king who lived 3,000 years ago and made some really poor decisions. This story is a part of the Bible. This part of the Bible is about you and me. It's about the everyday decisions that we make that either breaks relationship or heals them. And so the truth I want you to take away today, and listen for this throughout the message, when pride leads, God's wisdom leaves. So let's start with Rehoboam's first decision. The people have come to him, they've asked him to go easy on them, and Rehoboam says, come back in 3 days and I'll give you a decision. In the meantime, Rehoboam goes to the elders, and we see this in the reading. He goes to the older men, and these men were Solomon's advisors, the advisors of his father. And they tell him, if you serve the people, if you speak kindly to them and treat them kindly, they will serve you forever. That sounds like pretty good counsel. Treat the people well, and they'll treat you well. It's godly leadership. It's compassionate leadership. And it kind of reminds us of what Jesus said about leadership in Matthew 20. Jesus said, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. And so these older, wiser guys with a bit of life experience are saying to Rehoboam, just go easy on these people. They've worked very, very hard and serve these people. That's the king's role, is to serve the people. Rehoboam doesn't like that advice. He wants to look strong. He wants to prove that he's not living in his father's shadow. So he goes to the younger guys, his friends, the ones that he grew up with. And they say to him, forget what those old blokes said. You've got to show these people who's the boss. Tell them if they thought your dad was tough, they haven't seen anything yet. And Rehoboam accepts that advice. Verse 13 says, the king answered the people harshly, rejecting the advice given him by the elders. Now, as Belinda said last week, this is not about the fact, older people are wiser than young people. That's not the point that's being made here. It's about the nature of the wisdom that was given and Rehoboam's response to it. Belinda brought this a great message last week. It's online if you want to watch it again. From the first half of this chapter, the point that we learnt there was wise voices lead to wise choices. It's not about the age, it's about listening to wise voices, and they lead to wise choices, no matter the age. In the second half of the chapter that we're turning to now, though, as we dig deeper into this story, we learn when pride leads, God's wisdom leaves. And Rehoboam is leading with pride. I wonder if you saw the shift in the advice that Rehoboam was given. The older, wiser guys said, serve the people. And the younger guys said, no, don't do that. The people are supposed to serve you. You're the king. Rule over them. One answer spoke wisdom, the other spoke pride. And Rehoboam chose pride. See, pride always wants to prove something, doesn't it? Pride says, I'll show them. I'll show them who the leader is. Pride says, I can handle this on my own. I don't need my dad. I don't need these other guys' advice. I can handle this on my own. And when pride drives your decisions, humility is nowhere to be seen. I wonder if you ever do that. It seems here that Rehoboam kind of already knew what he wanted to do, but he's just going around trying to find someone who would agree with his decision. And he found that amongst the young people. We do that sometimes, don't we? We make up our mind, we make it look like we're looking for advice, but we're not really, because we already know what we're going to do. We're just looking for someone who's going to back us up and agree with us and make us feel better about the decision we're about to make. That's Rehoboam. Perhaps you've heard the saying, we make our decisions and then our decisions make us. That's true, isn't it? Of course, it simply means that you reap what you sow. We all have to live with the consequences of our decisions, and that's exactly what we see next in Rehoboam's life. Rehoboam's pride didn't just make him make a bad decision. It made him into the person he was to become. That's how pride works in our lives too. Pride makes us double down instead of backing down. It makes us defensive instead of reflective. Instead of wisely considering godly advice, pride pushes us to protect our ego and to prove our point. We see it in our arguments at home, don't we? When instead of saying sorry, we blame the other person for overreacting. And we see it maybe at work when a manager has made a bad decision and they won't admit it. Or we see it anytime we pass the buck instead of owning our part in a disagreement. So what do we do with that? Well, it starts with humility, doesn't it? We've got to slow down before we react. We've got to ask ourselves, how can I serve others in this decision? Jesus said, I have not come to be served, I've come to serve. And we have to follow Jesus in humility. And humility is not weakness. Humility gives us the courage to listen. It gives us the courage to apologise and to change our course when we know we're wrong. But you know what's even worse? Pride separates us from God. Pride is what keeps us distant from God because it says, I don't need your help, God. I've got this. But when we admit, God, I don't know you, and I don't know what you want here, and I can't fix my life on my own, when we approach him in that kind of humility, that's when the door is opened and his wisdom steps in. So remember that. Pride blocks God, but humility lets him in. That's what Rehoboam missed. Pride drove his decision. He shut God out of his decision, and the result was disastrous. On the other hand, humility invites God's wisdom into a situation. It invites his blessing into a situation and into our lives. So let's move on into verse 16. It says there, when all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, what share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David. In other words, when the people realised that the king was not going to help them and listen to them, they said, why should we serve this guy from David's royal family? We're done with him. Let's go home. The royal family can look after themselves. That's what they're saying here. And this is the moment in history when Israel split into the two distinct nations, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And Rehoboam's decision split. It caused this split. It was a monumental stuff-up in the history of the nation of Israel. One of the biggest fractures in the Bible story. And notice what caused it. It was not war. It wasn't an invasion. It was pride. And pride in the heart of a leader. Pride doesn't always explode with violence like war. Sometimes pride just slowly, quietly, even invisibly pushes people apart. Pride builds walls where bridges could have been built. And I think we've all seen that play out in our lives, haven't we? In our families, our friendships, even in churches. Maybe you've watched a friendship dissolve because one person refused to say, hey, listen, I might have made a mistake here. Let's talk about this. Or maybe you've seen a family member stop coming to Christmas dinner because nobody wanted to admit that they were at fault. Maybe you've seen that. Many families do. Or maybe you've even seen pride divide a church. You know, some people will often say, it's about a particular doctrine. We've disagreed about a doctrine. And maybe it is. But actually, usually, in amongst all of that is ego, right? Ego. People are unwilling to say, hey, listen, I was harsh in my words. Or we might disagree, but we can get along anyway. It's pride right in the middle of division. Pride builds walls. And Rehoboam's harsh decision, it told the people that they did not matter to him one bit. And people don't follow leaders who make them feel worthless. They follow leaders who serve them well. And friends, pride still does the same today. It pushes people away from each other. And worse still, pride pushes people away from God. On the other hand, humility builds bridges. It builds bridges between people, and it builds a bridge between us and God. Humility listens. Humility is the first one to reach out. Humility makes the first move. And of course, that's what Jesus did, isn't it? Jesus humbled himself to become a human being, and so reach out to us to reconnect God and people to God. And so, if you're a follower of Jesus today, we are to be like him, to be humble like Jesus, and let humility guide our decisions. Friends, Jesus has built a bridge to God. All we need to do is to step forward onto that bridge, make the humble decision to step forward onto that bridge and move forward towards God. Let's go back to Rehoboam. Now, after this split, the people had said, well, you're on your own, royal family, on your own. See you later, we're going home. So they went home. And after that, King Rehoboam realises that things are falling apart. His nation is falling apart. So what does he do? Well, he tries some diplomacy. Verse 18. King Rehoboam sent out Adoniram, who was in charge of the forced labour. That's an important point, remember that. Sent Rehoboam, who was in charge of the forced labour, but all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam, however, managed to get into his chariot and escape to Jerusalem. Well, that didn't end well, did it? And there's a very good reason why. Because do you remember why the people told the king to go look after yourself? We're gone, we're going home. Do you remember why? What caused the split? It was because the people had asked the king to go easy on them. We've been working hard, could you cut us a break? And he said, nope, you can't. And so Adoniram, of course, who was in charge of the forced labour, was not the person they wanted to see. Another bad decision to send this guy into that situation. Maybe Rehoboam thought that, well, this is a workplace relations matter. So the best person to send is the person in charge of the workforce. But that was clearly the wrong strategy here. Friends, it's just another really, really poor and godless decision. And it's a bad decision that cost a man his life. And it's supposed to be, that point is supposed to be a wake-up call for us. Because you see, pride leaves casualties in its wake, doesn't it? Because you might think, I've fallen out with this family member, I've fallen out with that family member, and I'm right and they're wrong. But there's the rest of the family who pay the price for that. Or you might say, well, I disagree with that church, or I disagree with this church. But you know what? It's the whole family of God that pays the price for that. Pride always leaves casualties in its wake. Rehoboam's pride not only broke relationships, it broke up a nation and it got people killed. Now, pride's just one problem. The other is godlessness, which is a form of pride, really. Because if you notice that at no point has Rehoboam spoken to God about any of these decisions. Not once. He never prayed about any of them. He never consulted a priest. He never sought out a prophet. He didn't even take the time to go to the temple and seek God there. He never once asked God what he should do. In his pride, Rehoboam had trusted his own wisdom, which was clearly inadequate. And as things weren't bad enough, without consulting the Lord, yet again, Rehoboam decides that the best course of action now is war in retaliation. No consultation with the Lord whatsoever. But we're going to go to war. No prayer, no visit to the temple, no priest, no prophet, no consultation. We're going to war. Now, humanly speaking, that may have seemed rational because Rehoboam's the king, of course. What's the king's job? The king's job is to keep the country together, to keep people united. And he had a rebellion on his hands, which is threatening to split the nation, and he needed to put down this rebellion. So it might have seemed reasonable to send in the forces. But you see, pride always seems reasonable. Pride always justifies itself. Pride says, I have to do this. Really? Pride finds reasons to keep fighting instead of just letting go and admitting we made a mistake. Pride makes you feel righteous even when you're wrong. It's why Rehoboam went around trying to find someone who would agree with his really bad decision, because he wanted to feel right, but he wasn't. Perhaps you're here today and you know exactly what that feels like. You've been in conflict, maybe at home or at work, and everything in you just wants to keep proving you're right. But deep down, the Holy Spirit is saying to you, Just let it go. And your pride says, I don't want to. Not yet. You see, pride will always find a reason to fight a battle that God has never called you to fight. Got to let it go. And maybe this example of Rehoboam, maybe through that the Lord is telling you, lay it down. Lay down control and let God lead in that circumstance. Maybe that's what you need to hear today. Maybe you've been white-knuckling a situation, holding on, you don't want to let go of it, trying to fix it, trying to control it, trying to manipulate it. But what if the most spiritual thing you could do, the most God-honouring thing you could do this week is just to stop and surrender and just let it go? There's always two sides to every story, and we need to admit our part in it and just let it go. See, friends, God can do so much more with your surrender than he can do with your prideful stubbornness. You stay in prideful stubbornness, there'll be no progress. And this thought leads us to the ultimate king, the one who truly heals division, the king who rules not with pride, but with humility and service and love. You see, while Rehoboam ruled with pride, Jesus rules with humility. Do you remember the story? Rehoboam said, I will make your yoke heavier. But Jesus said, come to me, because my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Rehoboam said, I'm not going to just whip you with a whip, I'm going to whip you with scorpions. And he did it to prove his power. But in humility, Jesus was scourged with a whip to save people. Rehoboam built walls that divided an entire nation. But Jesus came to break down the dividing wall that separates people from God. See, it's failures like Rehoboam's that make us wish for a better king. A king who serves instead of dominates. A king who heals instead of harms. And that king is Jesus. And here's how Scripture describes Jesus. It is a stark contrast to what we see in the life of Rehoboam. A picture of humility. It's so radical. Philippians 2, we read there, and Paul, the apostle, is writing to the Philippians about Jesus. And he says this, though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privilege. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. Can you feel the contrast between the humility of King Jesus and the pride of King Rehoboam? On the one hand, Rehoboam used his crown to crush people. And Jesus, on the other hand, took on a crown of thorns to save his people. That's the difference humility makes. It doesn't divide, it restores. And at the cross, Jesus tore down the wall that pride has built between us and God. He built a bridge of grace and forgiveness instead for us to walk across. And so as we wrap up here, the message from this passage is that we're supposed to remember today is that when pride leads, God's wisdom leaves. Pride shuts God out, but humility invites him in. And friends, if you're here today and you're not even sure if you believe in God, please know that you can't reach God through the door of pride. You can't. You can't come to God saying, I don't even know if you're real. Show yourself to me. Prove it. You cannot get to God. You will never see God through the door of pride. Jesus said in Matthew 5, blessed are the poor in spirit, For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You will never see or experience the kingdom of heaven unless you come to Jesus, poor in spirit, in humility. Access to godly wisdom comes through the door of humility to those who humbly admit that their spirit needs God. And there's a warning here for all of us. Rehoboam made his decisions without ever inviting God into it. And it split a nation. And Israel never really recovered from that. But you don't have to repeat that story. You can learn from Rehoboam's mistakes, and that's what I'm encouraging you to do today. Every decision you face, whether it's at home, at work, or in your relationships, every decision is a chance to either say, I've got this, or on the other hand, to say, God, I need you in this. When we lead with pride, God's wisdom leaves. But if we lead with humility, God's wisdom steps in and shows us the way forward. Pride blinds us. Humility guides us. So this week, before you react, before you decide, before you double down, stop, breathe, spend a moment to seek the Lord, because humble decisions invite divine direction.